Welcome into the latest episode of the Dribble Drive podcast. I am your host, Austin Render, bringing you episode 17 of our Dribble Drive summer and now, I guess, fall of as we get ready for the women's basketball season. We are officially inside a month away from the start of the season. We are counting down by Mondays because that is, of course, when this show comes out. It's also when the season will start, Monday, November 4th. We will have 3 shows between now and then a show on opening day, hoping to do something fun for that one. But we are going to continue previewing. We have 4 more teams left to do, or 5 more teams in the next 4 weeks. So there is going to be a double coming up here soon. But today we're going to focus on Maryland coming up soon. We will, if you are an Ohio State, Michigan, Purdue, Washington fan, we are going to get there. We have them lined up. We're ready to go. So we're going to get to those. If you are a fan of somebody else in the conference, maybe you missed your preview episode, go back and listen. We have had some wonderful episodes. Last week, Dalton Shetler from Michigan State came on the podcast, and we talked preseason accolades, all Big Ten team, the preseason media coaches rankings. We did a whole 45-minute episode on that, which was wonderful. So go back and listen to that if you're a fan of a Big Ten team. You want to hear some of your players and teams talked about. I think we touched on just about everybody in that episode last week. Obviously, all our episodes available on Spotify and Apple. However you found us today, that's the best way to find us. But we're also, if you want to watch us in video form, we're on the Back Home Network YouTube channel. We are a part of the Back Home Network podcast group. Appreciate them for bringing us on. We're also brought to you by Home Field Apparel. The whole network is brought to you by them. Like, subscribe, download, give us a rating. That's the kind of stuff that really helps us as we continue to. I know we're already 17 episodes in, but we're still trying to grow the product. If you've enjoyed what you've gotten from this podcast, go tell a friend, go tell a couple of friends. We want to continue to build that audience as we get ready for the start of the season. In terms of Big Ten news, last Wednesday was Big Ten Media Day. A lot of things going out on team-centered social media pages, as well as the Big Ten women's basketball. Obviously, we heard from all the coaches. We heard from student-athletes. Highly recommend just going back through, listening to some of that stuff. Certainly gets you ready for the season to come. Outside of that, the news is slim until we kind of get things going. Teams are full bore practicing right now, so excited to get things down. As a lot of teams several teams had their quote-unquote midnight madness last weekend or this weekend. Hoosiers that I'll be at is in a couple of weeks. So we're counting down the days to the start of the season. And as we do that, we continue to preview. And today's episode is a Maryland women's basketball preview, one of the top 5 teams in the conference preseason. And to do that, we bring on a man who wears a lot of hats out there in College Park. Brendan Hartlove joins us. Brendan, thanks so much for joining the show. How are you?
I am very well. Thank you so much for having me on, and congrats to you. Your podcast can almost vote, and that's a big accomplishment.
I guess we are. By election day, we might be able to vote. How about that? in terms of episodes, that'll be good timing. But Brendan Hartlove, one of the broadcasters for not only Maryland women's basketball, but a lot of sports around Maryland and the surrounding areas. Brendan, Maryland is such an interesting team this season, and we'll get into all of it. So many transfers, some really talented freshmen. There are some holdovers, but it's certainly going to be a very new Maryland team. I want to start by going back to last season. I think you'd call it a quote-unquote down year for Brenda Frese in Maryland, and those don't happen very often. And even her down year, they made a run in the Big Ten tournament. They get into the NCAA tournament. If that's your down year, obviously we know what Brenda Frese can do. That's a great thing that you've established. Your floor is, let's just get into the NCAA tournament, which Maryland did last year. They were a good team. We saw you guys a couple of times, but what was the thing that maybe was keeping Maryland from making that jump to a great team last year?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a lot of different factors in the sense that 19-14 overall is kind of unprecedented for Maryland women's basketball. It's the lowest winning percentage under Brenda Frese in over 2 decades. And like you said, even though it was a down year, still pretty good with the runs that you talked about. But Brenda Frese will be the first one to tell you that it was not up to the standard of Maryland women's basketball. A big part of that was injuries. They had the injury bug pretty bad throughout the majority of the season. And, sometimes during the year, it can feel a little bit like a cliche to say, oh, they're not winning because of the injuries. But I think now that we've had time to reflect on the season as a whole, you really start to realize how big of an impact those injuries had. And so that really tested Maryland's depth, which wasn't maybe at its best if you look at the last 10, 15, 20 years. But they really kind of had to piece it together as season on and some other players went down. So they did have one of the toughest schedules in the country. I think it finished around top 5 by the end of the year. So with some new faces coming in, Brenda Frese using the transfer portal last year to bring some players in, there is time to get up to speed, but then out the door the next year. So I think it was a lot of moving parts for last season. Brenda Frese had to try some things. Some things worked, some things didn't. And it'll be interesting to see what she carries over from last year into this year.
It does feel like every year she utilizes the transfer portal very well and gets new pieces to come in. And maybe last year, now they got some good pieces, but maybe it just didn't gel. And that is the part of the transfer portal. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And but again, she made the team work and got it into the postseason. I think one thing, and looking at the non-con schedule, and we'll talk about this later, but looking at this year's non-con schedule for Maryland, a little lighter in the sense of Maryland. Like usually I feel like there's South Carolina and UConn and some of these big programs. Now they are going to play Texas on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but at least early in the season, a road trip to Syracuse, a home game against Duke, and then a lot of mid-majors outside of those games. And I've noticed a bit of a theme, the Big Ten teams scheduling a little bit easier this year, maybe because of the depth of the conference. But I'm glad you pointed that out because Maryland does always play a tough non-con schedule. And it felt like they kind of got slapped in the face there early last season, but were able to recover better in Big Ten play. Shyanne Sellers is a big part of this team. You mentioned the injury bug. She was one of those players that was in, she was out, she was in, kind of back and forth as she dealt with those injuries. I don't think she played in the game that we came out to College Park for in January. What has she meant to this program? Because obviously she's back, and when she's healthy, she's as good as anybody in this conference. What has she meant to this program over her last 4 years?
I mean, so much. And I think first and foremost, she's an incredible player on the court. Her personality, I really think doesn't talk about enough when it comes to kind of the off the court. She is such a ray of light for Maryland women's basketball and really kind of one of the players that brings the team together and will certainly, as she was last year, but this year just as well, if not more, be one of the unquestionable leaders of this team. But yeah, on the court, she's phenomenal. You know, she just picked up her second all Big Ten first team selection, and she kind of in the point for Maryland last year. It was one of those weird kind of by committee point guard types of strategies for the Terps. I think with some of the new additions, you'll maybe see that change a little bit, but she is just so fun to watch. You know, for us that get to sit there and kind of call the games and really just take it all in. She is a very well-rounded player that means a lot. So yeah, when the Terps didn't have her due to injury, or I think she maybe had an illness 1 week or something like that, it really kind of showed that she is a key cog to that team. And this year, with so few players returning, her influence and impact on this team is just highlighted even more.
I think you and I talked about it when we chatted last year at College Park about how the point guard position was something that was missing for Maryland last year. And Shyanne Sellers played some of it. Maybe that's not the position she's most naturally ready to play. Same with Bree McDaniel, had to handle the ball a lot last year, and she's back as well. But I mean, this transfer haul is incredible. And it starts with a Big Ten transfer and Kayleen Smeichel coming over from Rutgers. If you've been around the league like we have, you know that Kayleen Smeichel is as talented as it gets in this league at the guard position. We saw her as a freshman jump onto the scene. Last year only played about a third of the season, but we know what she can do there. And then it's a host of people that maybe we're unfamiliar with, but others know, and Brenda Frese knows she's going to get some good production out of these players. There's a reason Maryland's picked fourth in the Big Ten. It's because of all these players that are coming in with all this talent. The big question is, how is it going to gel? I know it's October. We don't know what these teams are going to look like, Brendan, but what do you see from this transfer haul? Maybe a focus that Brenda Frese was trying to get after by some of the players she brought in.
I mean, when we look at it overall, the Terps added 10 new players to a 15-player roster. So, there's a handful in there, but it is almost a completely brand new team. 7 transfers coming in, so it's a revamped roster. You kind of mentioned the taking time to gel and things like that. I think that is something that will naturally take time, but the Terps have been proactive in that. They actually had an international trip to Croatia over the summer where the team went. That's more practices, more games, and just more time together off the court. And, Brenda Frese at Media Day saying that pickleball kind of activity of choice lately, and Shyanne Sellers saying that, it hasn't really been a challenge of getting people to hang out together. It's fitting them all in the same room. There are a lot of new faces and they all really enjoy hanging out together. So I think when you look at a lot of those new faces, it's something that, Maryland does revamp after last year and does need to add depth. And you mentioned Kayleen Smichael, all Big Ten second team last year, and Sarah Tibiaco is another guard that's coming in 5'5", so she's another one that will kind of maybe relieve some of that pressure from Shyanne Sellers to really control the offense. She's the A10 player of the year. Both of those players combined will add a lot of offensive, prowess to what Maryland's trying to do. And then defensively as well, that's something that Maryland was looking to kind of fill some holes, kind of realizing that they had some deficiencies in areas. And so Christina Dalsey, who is a 6'2" forward coming over from Villanova last year, the Big East's co-defensive player of the year. And then Saylor Poffenbarger, who is a Maryland native, but coming back to her kind of hometown from Arkansas. She's 6'2", averaged a double-double last year, and I believe set Arkansas's record for most defensive rebounds in a season, something like that. So those two players, as well as, those are only 4 of the 7 transfers, tossing some great freshmen that Brenda Frese always finds somehow. And I think Maryland is looking in pretty good shape. But again, 10 new players out of 15, there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of unknowns as well.
Might be another reason why the schedule maybe eases up at the top half of it because of how new this team is going to be. I did a quick calculation here. If you just ran with the 7 transfers, just made them a 7-person team, last year's production, you'd score 80.5 points a game. So there's a lot of offensive production coming in from this transfer class. 5 of them double-digit scores, plus, as you mentioned, the defense from Christina Dalsey and then you got Amari DeBerry coming over from UConn, which it's hard to take into account what 1 point a game means at UConn. Like that has a different meaning to it than it does at other places. So getting to spend some time with Gino Auriemma is never a bad thing there for Amari DeBerry. I'm glad you mentioned the defense because last year when you do prep on Maryland, one of the issues was defense. I mean, it was a glaring weakness when you look at like the color-coded numbers when you're preparing for things and you're looking at all the stats. Defensively, it was a lot of red last year for Maryland, which is just not normal for a Brenda Frese team. Rebounding was another issue, and it does sound like with this portal haul, maybe with the freshman haul, with better health, that is set to improve this year because, I mean, honestly, there were some numbers that couldn't get worse in their defense. I think their 3-point defense was one of the worst in the league last year. So it does feel like Brenda Frese has put an emphasis on that in the transfer portal.
Certainly. And I think the Terps tried a couple different schemes and things like that last year when things weren't quite working out the way that they wanted. And so that was something that Brenda Frese trying to adapt on the fly. But I think when you look at the players that are coming in, it's something where I want to say off the top of my head, it's maybe 6 of the incoming are 6 feet or taller. It's something like that. It's a large majority of the newcomers that bring some height, and with height doesn't always come defense, but that is kind of the theory here for Maryland. And they went out and, like I said, they looked at some of those deficiencies from last year. You're right. Defense was a big one. That's something that they just couldn't quite figure out with that group. And, the players with injuries coming in and out and changing that over, I'm sure, going to make that tough. But I think that Brenda Frese and her staff, they will be the first to put their hand up for that kind of thing and say that that's an area they want to improve. And they went out and they found those players. And so Brenda Frese at Media Day saying that they kind of looked at every area they wanted to improve, and between 7 transfers and 3 freshmen, she is very confident that they kind of shored up some of those leaks in the boat, if you will.
Yeah, and it's not just Shyanne Sellers that's coming back as well. I know we've mentioned, we'll talk about the freshmen, but 10 newcomers. But of the people who have stayed, obviously Shyanne Sellers is the headliner, but Bree McDaniel took big steps last year in her role. Allie Kubek, Emily Fisher as well. Those are some that it's not as if they left the cupboard bare. They are building with some good pieces that are still there and adding great pieces from the transfer portal. But I would imagine that Brenda Frese is going to lean heavily, at least early in the year, on those returners to help build the culture at Maryland.
Yeah, absolutely. When you lose players like Jakia Brown-Turner, Brene Alexander, Lavender Briggs, Faith Masonis, who was kind of the heart and soul in a lot of ways of that team, that is something that we're going to need to be some adjustments. And so it is, you're right, that it is very fortunate that Maryland has a key group of players returning. Bree McDaniel, like we said, huge breakout season last year, was maybe kind of thrust into things a little bit earlier, a little bit differently than maybe Brenda Frese and her staff had envisioned. And she performed admirably. I don't think that Maryland can be disappointed in the way that Brene Alexander at this stage of her career was able to contribute to, a team that made it to the NCAA tournament and the Big Ten tournament semifinals. And Allie Kubek, I think, doesn't get talked about enough when it comes to Maryland, because Shyanne Sellers gets a lot of the accolades and attention, and rightfully so, as well as some of those big name players that were grad transfers or the more experienced ones that I mentioned have left. But she had a really strong second half of the season, and that's a player that transferred into Maryland, but really before she was able to get going, had a huge ACL injury, obviously taking a really long time to get back. But I think Maryland is starting to see the fully formed version of Allie Kubek that they had hoped they would get when they were recruiting her. So yeah, I think those 5 returning players are getting back healthy, which I think is huge, because some of them were out for large chunks of last season, and also really just kind of help Brenda Frese get the other 10 new players up to speed on what it means to play Maryland women's basketball. And we talked about this, but I always find the, coaches give the cliche, oh, we're going to go out there, we're going to play Maryland basketball, we're going to play Indiana basketball. And sometimes we're like, well, what does that mean necessarily? How do you quantify that or qualify that? And sometimes you can't. Sometimes the only people that can are the ones that are in the locker room every day. And for Brenda Frese, she fortunately has some players in those like Sellers, McDaniel, Kubek that can help teach Maryland basketball to those new faces coming in.
Yeah, Kubek was thrown into maybe more of a role last year. 17 starts for her, maybe a player that's in the perfect world coming off the bench and providing a jolt there, and had to start a lot last year. Emma Chardon's the other returner. She comes off of an injury last year. So like you said, getting them healthy. You always face injuries. That's part of sports and certainly basketball. But like you said, developing that depth is going to be big. And I think a big part of that depth is adding some of these freshmen that she's brought in. And I don't expect you to be an expert on these 3 freshmen, because none of us have seen them yet. But right. Brianna Williams, Ava McKinney, and Kendall Walker, all top 45-ish products. I mean, it just depends on what ranking system you look at. But Brenda Frese said, okay, we're going to go get really talented transfer portal people, but also let's kind of sprinkle some future in this as well. Let's invest in our future and go get 3 really talented freshmen. Do you expect them to see playing time early, or do you think that's just an establishment of depth to just maybe be supplementary pieces?
I think it's probably going to be a bit more of the latter. Again, it is going to be really interesting to see how Brenda Frese and her staff view this team. Is not like they went out to the transfer portal and got some player. Like, they aren't necessarily depth pieces from the portal. Like we already established, there's some really top talented players. And so Brenda Frese is never going to bring in a freshman class that is only going to sit there for the entire season and just kind of learn and things. She is going to get them opportunities, I think, definitely in kind of that non-conference schedule that is maybe by comparison a little bit better than Maryland has had over the last couple of years. I do think that changing landscape of the Big Ten probably has something to do with where coaches focus non-conference attention. But I think those are scheduled with some of these freshmen in mind, just to get them reps, get them out there and starting to kind of feel like they are part of the program. So I think it's going to be very interesting because, certainly Brenda Frese and her staff are hoping that it's not the same kind of injury bug as last year. It might happen. We don't know. And so having those freshmen prepared to step in if they need to, I think is going to be really paramount. So yeah, they are some really talented players that, again, I think are going to hopefully pan out for Maryland. But it is one of those weird things when you think about it. This whole transfer portal that has changed the landscape of college sports so much in the last couple of years, to only have 3 freshmen coming in to a 15 player team, that is kind of unique, especially for Brenda Frese in Maryland, because what happens next year when some of those players graduate and you're looking at who's going to make that next step that aren't freshmen anymore? Only having 3 that could make that step is kind of interesting. But knowing Brenda Frese and Blair, the whole staff, they have a plan, and it's not just we'll kind of see how things go. They have a regimented plan that they're looking to develop these players, but that obviously will kind of ebb and flow and change throughout the season.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how they handle this team because it's so different from last year. There is more depth, but there's also and maybe more toys to play with for the coaching staff in terms of the talent they brought in. Just in terms of her coaching style in general, obviously Maryland came out gangbusters in the Big Ten and just dominated the conference for years there at the start of their tenure in the conference. They're no longer the newbies because we've added 4 teams now this year. So Maryland Rutgers are off the hook. No longer the newbies in the conference. Lately, it has been maybe more even. I'm not saying that they're struggling, but more even in the conference. Do you think it's more so that the Big Ten has caught up with the Maryland Terrapins, with their depth, with their talent, or is it maybe something that Brenda Frese has to change to kind of adapt to the changing landscape of college basketball?
I don't want this to sound like a cop-out answer, but I do think it is genuinely both, because I think Maryland coming into the Big Ten really kind of, when you have a team come in that is so dominant, it is going to demand of the pre-existing teams that they're like, oh, okay, what was our kind of baseline is no longer our baseline. That has shifted. And so I think in a lot of ways, other teams in the Big Ten have caught up, and the transfer portal really helped some of those teams round out those rosters that otherwise kind of would have, held their own in the Big Ten, but now really start to push for some things where, Maryland, they were dominant. And when you look at last season, we talked about some of those defensive numbers, and we talked about the 19 and 14 and the 4 straight losses for, I think, the first time under Brenda Frese. If not, it had been a long time. So that was definitely kind of a look yourselves in the mirror type of thing when it came to the last season. But I think that the Big Ten overall, and especially with the addition of these new teams coming in, Frese said at Media Day that every game is going to be like an NCAA tournament game, because there are some high profile historic programs coming into the conference for just your normal conference games, when, otherwise those are the ones you circle on the calendar as the big ones or the matchups you hope to get in the postseason. Big Ten games now, they are conference games that kind of count in that run of play. So I think it is going to be very interesting to see now how the introduction of these other teams, will they have the same effect that Maryland did coming in, where it kind of forces the rest of the conference to raise the standard a little bit to compete and kind of make the Big Ten one of, if not the best, women's basketball conference in the country that we've known it to be.
Yeah, I think Maryland should get a lot of credit for how good the Big Ten has gotten, because they came in and everybody else, like you said, was like, whoa, is that what we have to do? How do we compete with this? And they figured it out. And there's a lot of great coaches in this league, and they figured out how to compete with them. You think about Northwestern in 2019 and 2020, and Iowa, of course, the past couple of years, Indiana, Ohio State, Michigan. They have figured out how to compete with Maryland, but it wasn't the case in 2015 and 16 and 17 and 18. Maryland just dominated, ran through the conference. And I think Maryland deserves a lot of credit for the increase of play, the depth that the conference now has, because everybody looked in the mirror and said, okay, we have to get better. I think that's a great point, because you add in USC and UCLA now two teams that are going to probably be preseason top 5. They're the preseason 1 and 2 in the league. And they're going to make you have to be better because they're going to set a standard of play that everybody else is going to have to meet. So that is part of the thing. When you add teams as dominant like Maryland or USC and UCLA, it's going to make everybody better. We mentioned the non-conference schedule a little bit. The headliners in November, Duke comes to the Xfinity Center. Maryland goes at Syracuse. Other than that, it's some kind of a mixed bag of mid-majors, UMBC, Towson, a lot of those East Coast teams, Mount St. Mary's, a Navy Classic in Annapolis against George Mason and Toledo. The headliner of the non-conference is January 20th, when they will take on the Texas Longhorns in Newark, New Jersey. But before then, it is a bit of a more tame non-conference schedule than what we are used to for Maryland. I mean, you just go back to last season, and obviously maybe the team wasn't necessarily ready for it last year, but after a game against Harvard, it went at South Carolina, at UConn, bang, bang, right? Yeah. Games 2 and 3, and they were both lopsided losses. And then you play Syracuse, who's a really good team. They go to Cancun and play Washington State, another ranked team. Green Bay, who's always solid. So it was like right out of the gate, bang, Maryland had a tough schedule. Easier this year. Now, Duke and Syracuse are still very good teams and should not be taken lightly, and I'm not trying to discount them, but it is different than starting it out with UConn, South Carolina. So when you look at this non-conference schedule, does anything jump out to you about what to expect from Maryland the first month or two of the season?
I expect them not to have to travel too far because Towson, UMBC, Mount St. Mary's, all of those, maybe it's not put as many miles on the legs when you now have West Coast trips that you're forced to take because of Big Ten play. I don't know if that's actually the case. It's just an observation or so.
We've had a hypothesis about that from a couple of people on the show. Interesting. Is that schedules appear, I mean, Oregon doesn't have a true road game in their entire non-conference schedule. I'm seeing like inklings of this hypothesis. Iowa's a bit of a caveat. Ohio State's got some big games, but like there's a decent amount of teams when you look at the schedule, you're like, oh, they don't play anybody on the road. Indiana's only road game is at Butler, which
wow,
is that really a road game? Like let's be honest here. We're driving up I-69 an hour and boom, we're there. Obviously, they're going to the Bahamas for a tournament, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that is something that we've noticed, and Maryland seems to be following suit with that. I mean, I don't live in your area, but going to UMBC doesn't feel like too big of a haul for Maryland to start the season.
45 minutes with traffic, maybe something like that. Nothing too crazy. Towson, a little further than that.
Syracuse probably isn't a simple trip, no. But then you've got 2 games in Annapolis, and that's it. So Syracuse is the one trip that is really being made there for Maryland.
Well, add me to the list that are part of that theory, because that's something I had just been bouncing around in my own head. It's pretty validating to hear that some other people had that same thought. And yeah, I mean, I think that maybe there's a travel factor, but I also think when you look at kind of the load or the caliber of opposition for some of those non-conference schedules, yes, it's maybe not what it has been, but you also have to look at the caliber of conference games that have now been added to your schedule that are no longer negotiable. And that maybe is your 1-2 punch of the South Carolina UConn is now some of those USC's, UCLA's that are all of a sudden on your schedule just because the conference is. And, there's a whole conference realignment conversation. That's a different podcast, but I think that, that definitely has kind of shaken some things up as well in terms of who's able to schedule who at what times and things like that. But yeah, Brenda Frese and the Terps aren't going to have to leave the DMV too much. And I think that is going to be pretty nice when you're talking about keeping players fresh and legs, with them and healthy and all things like that. But it is also interesting because, there's now some local derbies going on, to borrow a soccer term. And I think that always adds a little bit of an interesting dynamic, of those that, you maybe don't get otherwise. But yeah, it's going to be, I think this is one of those things that will probably benefit Maryland when you're adding 10 new players to a 15-person team. Every time I say that out loud, that still just sounds ridiculous in a positive way. But you're going to need time to get them together. Like, sure, they might be very close off the court and things like that, but you're learning a new system. And, I think that's something that definitely takes time, especially for the transfer players that are used to a system, maybe for a couple years now, that they know like the back of their hand. All of a sudden, they now have to switch to Brenda ball, as I like to call it, which is, can be very different than some of the other ones. And she said at media day, they are going to be fast. And I think that's something that Maryland maybe has gotten away from a little bit over the last couple of years. They've tried it, maybe it hasn't worked, so you have to adjust the thing. But I'm not saying we're going back to the 2015 levels of Maryland dominance, but I think we are seeing a return to a similar style and mentality of team that Maryland and Brenda Frese maybe had back then.
We talked about it last week with Dalton on the Accolades podcast. I put Maryland fourth. I thought and again, I think 4 through 10, we talked about this last week, is a total coin flip. All those teams are really good, but I did put Maryland at 4, a mixture of I didn't think Brenda Frese is going to have back-to-back down years, and also all the talent she brought in. Some of it's got to pan out. I mean, there's enough there that something has to throw enough stuff at the wall. Something's going to stick. And she went ahead and just got a bunch of new players to bring in there to go along with a couple of good returners. But it will be interesting. Maybe we need to have like a couple of the ADs on and figure out the scheduling thing. Hey, did you guys do this on purpose? But yeah, I also think it's important you mentioned the local derbies. With how much is changing in conference realignment, I think it's fun that those things still remain. And there's still a place for that in basketball. Football, maybe not as much, but in basketball, there's still room for Maryland to play UMBC and Towson and some of these other schools around the area. For Indiana, it's Butler, it's Evansville, it's stuff like that. Now, are those teams going to be super competitive? No, but I still think that's an important part of this, that we don't totally want to lose grasp on and have Maryland always playing somebody time zones away from them.
Right. And I think it's also kind of interesting because one thing that there's a little bit of fact and a little bit of my own kind of, speculation involved in this. But I remember Brenda kind of saying that when it comes to NIL and the transfer portal and things like that, one of Maryland's big things, they can't always compete with the NIL, all of this type of thing. Bringing in players that are local, maybe bringing them back home, like Poffenbarger. Like, she's a great example. You had some of the transfers that came in last year that have now graduated. Same thing, that kind of homecoming. And so I think that there is an element of, playing local, kind of establishing those local ties. And, the speculation part of it for me is not a bad opportunity to maybe scout some players for the future that are maybe looking to make that next step up. I think of Ali Kubek. She's the one that comes to mind that, very successful there and wants to stay close to home and able to kind of continue that on with Maryland. So that's my own kind of view on it. Yeah, I think that there is definitely something to be said in the madness that is the college sports landscape right now, that we can still have some of those local games that, you played with some of the other players growing up, and there's those kinds of things going on that make for some great storylines for us.
I think that speculation's fair. I think they're always recruiting. They're always scouting. If you think about even little things like watching a handshake line after a game, and you're like, who's talking to who? But
get the body language experts out. Yep.
Yes, exactly. Bring the body language and the mouth reading, lip reading people to tell you what's being said. We'll wrap on this. Maryland gets USC and UCLA in the Xfinity Center, which is I think that's going to be one of the biggest breaks in the schedule for teams, is not having to play at UCLA and at USC, who are the two prohibitive favorites in this league. It's going to be an unbalanced schedule. That's how it's going to work now with 18 teams. At least everybody plays each other once. Maryland's double play is Rutgers. I think that's correct.
I think so. I was looking too closely at last year's roster.
No, it's Ohio State.
Schedule in preparation for this that I'm now confusing them. Okay.
Yes, it's Ohio State is the two play. So that is a bit of a tougher – that's on the tougher end of the double play, is having to play Ohio State both home and away. But again, I think it is a break to get the LA schools at home. It's a break just not to have to go out there. Maryland's West Coast trip will be to Eugene and Washington the second week of February, the 6th through the 9th. You get Nebraska at home. You get Michigan at home. You get Illinois at home. Minnesota at home, Michigan State at home. Those are all big breaks. Obviously, they have to go to Ohio State, Indiana, and Iowa. But I would say it's all on paper. It means nothing. But when you look at it right now, you're like, okay, that schedule's not bad for Maryland, for a team that feels like they're going to be at least in that second tier, trying to challenge the top tier.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment. And if you're Brenda Frese and the Terps, this is about as good of a schedule you could hope to have in terms of how it's kind of handed to you in the travel sense and the who you're playing. I do think that, not having to go to LA, I'm sure the weather would be great at that time of year. And I think some teams will always be looking forward to that. But not having to make a huge trip out there is always good, especially for a team that dealt with a lot of injuries last year. You just don't have to be cramped up on a plane for that long and the quick turnarounds and things like that. So I think it will be really interesting to see how Maryland approaches that. And kind of, I think the Nebraska game is going to be one of the biggest ones, especially towards that mid-February mark, that really could have, playoff and conference implications, because that obviously a big game last year in the tournament. So that's one, as excited as I am for some of the new schools coming. I think that is one that I'm definitely looking out for. And you talk about those two teams that are the preseason 1 and 2. The fact that they're 1 and 2 without having played a conference game yet just goes to show the caliber of team that is coming in to be right there at the top and just be respected so much. It's already the expectation coming in. So, I think this is the biggest shakeup to the conference. I don't think that's an understatement since 2015 when Maryland came in, not just because the amount of teams and the travel, but the caliber of team that's coming in. Yeah. So for Maryland to have some of those teams at home, I think will certainly kind of give them, a bit of a boost when it comes to that home court advantage, I guess.
Yeah, 50% of the all Big Ten preseason team have not played a single Big Ten conference game yet. Obviously, 4
and you
from
can't
the
even
LA
be mad
schools.
about that.
Yeah, 4 from the LA schools, and then Lucy Olson from Iowa as well. So it's going to be a new look Big Ten. You think about the faces of the league the last few years: the Caitlin Clarks, the Mackenzie Holmes, the Diamond Millers, the J.C. Sheldons, the Layla Felias. They're gone, and it's opening up a void for new people to step in and be those stars of the conference, which is certainly exciting. Brendan, I appreciate you coming on. This has been great talking some Maryland women's basketball. We are less than a month from the start of the season, which is certainly exciting with this new look Big Ten. We appreciate you spending some time with us on the Dribble Drive.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And hey, anytime, you know how to get your thing.
We appreciate it. That's Brendan Hartlove from the Maryland broadcast. He's one of the play-by-play broadcasters for the women's basketball team. We appreciate you, Brendan, and we appreciate all of you fans for continuing to listen to the podcast. Download, subscribe, hit that like button, give us a rating. That's the kind of stuff that really helps us. And then tell a friend and let them know what we're up to here every Monday on the Back Home Network YouTube channel and on the Spotify and Apple podcast feeds. We continue the previews next Monday. Until then, for Brendan Hartlove, I'm Austin Render saying so long from the Dribble Drive podcast.